Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Our today's session is a continuation on the novel Tess of the D'Urberville, and we would continue with the textual analysis of phase 2 that is titled as Maiden No More. Well, before I go on with today's session, I would just like to share a quick review of the previous session. Here is the summary of the previous session. In the previous session, we started phase 1 of the novel Tess of the D'Urberville. We covered chapters 1 to 11, which means we successfully finished phase 1 of the novel. In doing so, we covered the following aspects. We explored the text of these chapters. We saw important events, happenings taking place. We explored the related themes that were embedded in the text of these chapters. I also discussed the development of characters and characters as they were introduced through the phase 1, that is the introductory phase. I also presented a critical analysis of the selected parts of the text in order to make a few points that I thought were of critical or crucial importance. As far as today's session is concerned, as I have already said, we will start phase 2 of the novel in this session. We will cover chapters 12 to 15. This implies that the chapter numbers that would be used would continue in a sequence from 1 onwards as started in phase 1, irrespective of the beginning of a new phase or new section. And this numbering is on the basis of the total chapters in the text or in the novel. So the first chapter in phase 2 thus is numbered as number 12. The reason for doing so is that the novel is divided into 7 phases. If each chapter is numbered separately in terms of chapters, it might create confusion because the number of phases is quite big. So the sequence for the totality of numbers would be continued throughout. Following the same scheme of analysis that we used for phase 1 of the novel, we would go through phase 2. So here is the opening text of chapter 12. Well, this introductory part of chapter 12, that is an introductory part, of course, of phase 2 as well, would present the picture of Tess coming back from the first job that she had undertaken in order to support her family after the death of their horse, Prince. If you remember, in the first phase, we were introduced to Tess as a young girl who was, I would say, the only responsible person or member in the family. And when in an unfortunate accident that was somehow caused by Tess, Prince, that is the horse of the family, and that is the main source of the income for the family as well, it died. She started thinking herself to be responsible for killing Prince, and she wanted to support her family. Now, in order to bring some kind of financial ease to the family, she decided to do some job, and it was because of this desire that she left her place, and despite her reservations about Alec, she decided to work at Alec's place. And if you can recall, actually, the purpose of Tess to go to Alec's place, though, was to seek a job there to support her family. The purpose of her parents to send her there was quite different. As far as her father was concerned, he wanted her to go there to make claims about her lineage or her connection with the D'Urberville family that was explored by, or that came to the knowledge of her father accidentally, as we saw in first phase. As far as her mother is concerned, well, her mother wanted her to go there not to do a job, rather to get married, and actually what she just wanted, or what she was looking forward to, was that Tess would be married to somebody rich, somebody noble, the person who would not only support Tess but would also be a source of financial support for the family of Tess. In this background, Tess went to Alex's place, where apparently her job was to help Alex's mother take care of the birds that she had. There we noticed how throughout her stay Alec was trying to seduce her, and towards the close of phase 1 we saw how one day when she was coming back from a trip from the market, how she was caught up into the situation and how Alec took advantage of the situation. Finally he was successful in seducing Tess. That was the time when Tess decided to go back. Now this phase introduces her journey back home. Right now the opening text of chapter 12 tells us as she is on her way back to her home. The basket was heavy and the bundle was large, but she lodged them along like a person who did not find her special burden in material things. Occasionally she stopped to rest in a mechanical way by some gate or post, and then, giving the baggage another hitch upon her full round arm, went steadily on again. It was a Sunday morning in late October, about 4 months after Tess D'Urberville's arrival at Trantridge, and some few weeks subsequent to the night ride in the chase. The time was not long past daybreak, and the yellow luminosity upon the horizon behind her back lighted the ridge towards which her face was set, the barrier of the vale wherein she had of late been a stranger, which she would have to climb over to reach her birthplace. The ascent was gradual on this side, and the soil and scenery differed much from those within the Blakemore Vale. Even the character and accent of the two peoples had shades of difference, despite the amalgamating effects of a roundabout railway, so that though less than 20 miles from the place of her sojourn at Trantridge, her native village had seemed a far away spot. Commenting on this, I would say that it was, number one, not about the physical, the material, the geographical distance. It was the emotional stress that was adding to the length of the journey when it comes to Tess. Secondly, in terms of geography, in terms of the landscape, both the areas were completely different. This difference in landscape also suggests, and I would say Hardy has used it very, very skillfully to suggest the difference in the nature of people, the difference that journey from one land to the other has brought to the life of Tess. The field folk shut in their traded northward and westward, travelled, courted and married northward and westward, thought northward and westward. Those on this side mainly directed their energies and attention to the east and south. So what we notice is that Hardy gives a detailed description of geography, of landscape, of the nature of people, of the history of people, in order to add some kind of authenticity to what he writes. Anyhow, the text continues. The incline was the same down which D'Urberville had driven her so wildly on that day in June. Tess went up the remainder of its length without stopping, and on reaching the edge of the escarpment, gazed over the familiar green world beyond, now half veiled in mist. Again, the symbol of mist is used to create a kind of lack of clarity where things are not clear. For Tess now, the future is not clear. It was always beautiful from here. It was terribly beautiful to Tess today. For since her eyes last fell upon it, she had learnt that the serpent hisses where the sweet birds sing, and her views of life had been totally changed for her by the lesson. Again, credit goes to Hardy, how he uses symbols and he uses imagery, right picking from the backdrop and he uses it to convey a lot of meanings. The sweet chirping of birds, the sweet singing of birds, that was a landmark of the area that she enjoyed when she was going on her way, while she was moving towards Alec's place. Now it has changed its meaning. The beautiful singing now sounds like serpents hissing, which indicates on the symbolic level that something has poisoned the life of Tess. And relating it to the lesson she has learned, relating to what has happened to her towards the end of the previous phase, we can very well see how her perspective or her view on life has changed. From a simple, innocent girl who does not know anything about the world and who doesn't know anything about men, she has changed suddenly into a mature and far more experienced woman, though the experience was very, very bitter. Verily, another girl than the simple one she had been at home was she who, bowed by thought, stood still there and turned to look behind her. She could not bear to look forward into the vale. Ascending by the long white road that Tess herself had just laboured up, she saw a two-wheeled vehicle beside which walked a man who held up his hand to attract her attention. She obeyed the signal to wait for him with unspeculative response, and in a few minutes man and horse stopped beside her. "Why did you slip away by stealth like this?" said D'Urberville. This is now Alec, who is again there, with upbraiding breathlessness. "On a Sunday morning, too, when people were all in bed. I only discovered it by accident, and I have been driving like the deuce to overtake you. Just look at the mare. Why go off like this? You know that nobody wished to hinder your going, and how unnecessary it has been for you to toil along on foot and encumber yourself with this heavy load. I have followed like a madman simply to drive you the rest of the distance if you won't come back." This is what Alec says to Tess. The text continues and we notice Tess's response. She says, "I shan't come back," said she. "I thought you wouldn't. I said so. Well, then put up your basket and let me help you on." She listlessly placed her basket and bundle within the dog cart and stepped up, and they sat side by side. She had no fear of him now, as in the cause of her confidence her sorrow lay. D'Urberville mechanically lit a cigar, and the journey was continued with broken, unemotional conversation on the commonplace objects by the wayside. He had quite forgotten his struggle to kiss her when in the early summer they had driven in the opposite direction along the same road. But she had not, and she sat now like a puppet, replying to his remarks in monosyllables. So she's just acting like a robot, very, very mechanical, showing no emotions, no feelings. We can notice the trauma that she has been through. After some miles, they came in view of the clump of trees beyond which the village of Marlotte stood. It was only then that her still face showed the least emotion, a tear or two beginning to trickle down. The tears of loss, of sorrow, as an expression of sorrow at the loss that she has suffered. "Why are you crying for?" he coldly asked. "I was only thinking that I was born over there," murmured Tess. "Well, we must all be born somewhere. I wish I had never been born there or anywhere else." And these words of Tess, we notice, they show her complete disinterest in life now at this time point. This also shows her misery and her feelings. "Oh, well, if you didn't wish to come to Trantridge, why did you come?" So what we notice is Alec is blaming her for all that. She didn't reply. "You didn't come for love of me, that I'll swear." It's quite true. If I had gone for love of you, if I had ever sincerely loved you, if I loved you still, I shouldn't be loathe and hate myself for my weakness as I do now. My eyes were dazed by you for a little, and that was all. When Tess says, my eyes were dazed by you for a little and that was all, it shows that she blames herself. She blames her own weakness in the whole event, and instead of blaming Alec, she thinks that she is responsible for what happened to her. For the first time, maybe I would say, in terms of this case, we see guilt. We have seen her being guilty before this. We noticed it when it was the death of Prince, where she blamed herself and she felt guilty for what she did to her family. Now again, she holds herself responsible for what has happened. Overall, when we look at chapter 12 of this phase, we notice a few things happening. After a few weeks of confusion regarding how she should react towards Alec, Tess realizes that she feels no love for him. So she decides to leave the D'Urberville mansion and to go to her home. So on a Sunday morning in late October, as I read the text for you and you notice that, several weeks after the night ride in the chase, Tess travels home in the early morning hours. Alec discovers her on the road, as you saw in the text. He questions her early departure and tries to convince her to return with him. When she refuses, he offers to drive her the rest of the way home, but she refuses even this offer. Alec tells Tess to let him know should she ever need help. After Alec finally leaves her, Tess continues on her way home, randomly passing by a sign painter. He is carrying a tin pot of red paint that he is using to paint small walls or gates that would come on the way. He is busy painting Bible passages onto random walls and gates throughout the countryside, and he paints a quote from the Bible on a style that is, "Thy damnation slumbereth not." These words affect Tess, and she asks the painter if he believes the words he paints. He answers affirmatively. She tries to ask him for advice about her plight and asks what if somebody's sin is not what she or he herself or himself seeks for, but he tells her to go and see a clergyman at a nearby church and says that he cannot give answer to this question. She anyhow continues home, where her mother is surprised to see her. Her mother is frustrated when Tess tells her what happened to her and criticizes her for not making Alec marry her. This is the mother who criticizes Tess that she couldn't do this, that she could not convince Alec to marry her. However, the mother softens when Tess blames her that she never warned Tess of the danger she faced. Well, as I have already said, that on her way back home she met a painter who with red paint was coating or painting some quotes from the text of Bible onto the walls and gates that would come along his way on his journey through the countryside. Tess meets this painter and asks questions. This is what I have already mentioned. Here is some relevant part of the text that I would like to share, where Tess meets this painter. Hardy writes, "As she walked, however, some footsteps approached behind her, the footsteps of a man, and owing to the briskness of his advance, he was close at her heels and had said, 'Good morning,' before she had been long aware of his propinquity. He appeared to be an artisan of some sort and carried a tin pot of red paint in his hand. He asked in a businesslike manner if he should take her basket, which she permitted him to do, walking beside him. 'It is early to be astir this Sabbath morn,' he said cheerfully. 'Yes,' said Tess, 'when most people are at rest from their week's work.' She also assented to this. 'Though I do more real work today than all the week besides.' 'Do you? All the week I work for the glory of man, and on Sunday for the glory of God.' This is the answer of the painter. 'That's more real than the other, hey? I have a little to do here at this stile.' The man turned as he spoke to an opening at the roadside leading into a pasture. 'If you'll wait a moment,' he added, 'I shall not be long.' And as he had her basket, she could not well do otherwise, and she waited, observing him. He set down her basket and the tin pot, and stirring the paint with the brush that was in it, began painting large square letters on the middle board of the three composing the style, placing a comma after each word as if to give pause while the word was driven well. And the text continues on this slide. Home to the reader's heart, his words come, thy damnation slumbereth not. Against the peaceful landscape, the pale decaying tints of the corpses, the blue air of the horizon, and the lichened still boards, these staring vermilion words shone forth. They seemed to shout themselves out and make the atmosphere ring. Some people might have cried, alas, poor theology, at the hideous defacement, the last grotesque phase of a creed which had served mankind well in its time, but the words entered Tess with accusatory horror. It was as if this man had known her recent history, yet he was a total stranger. Now again, it is the guilty conscience of Tess that makes her feel as if the man knows her history and as if these words are written for her. Having finished this text anyhow, he picked up her basket and they mechanically resumed her walk beside him. And she resumed mechanically her walk beside him. Do you believe what you paint? She asked in low tones. Believe that text? Do I believe in my own existence? So the man rather questions. But, said she tremulously, suppose your sin was not of your own seeking. He shook his head. I cannot split hairs on that burning query, he said. I have walked hundreds of miles this past summer, painting these texts on every wall, gate and stile, the length and breadth of this district. I leave their application to the hearts of the people who read them. That is, who read them. I think they're horrible, said Tess. Crushing, killing. So this is her response because of her own feeling of guilt. When it comes to the important discussion points with reference to this chapter, I would say that Hardy continues to leave many of the details of Tess's seduction ambiguous by allowing a certain space of time to pass between the night at the chase and Tess's return to Marlott several weeks later. The question arises, who is to be blamed for the whole event? Alec only, Tess, or both? Tess admits that her eyes were a little dazed by Alec and that the event was a moment of her own weakness. She finds herself to blame for Alec's seduction of her rather than accusing him of treachery. An important theme that emerges at this stage is the theme of guilt. However, apart from this theme of guilt, the other theme that emerges is the theme of forgiveness. The encounter of Tess with the painter introduces this theme of forgiveness that will continue actually throughout the novel. Tess wonders whether or not what she has done may be forgiven. She doubts that according to the Christian teachings she would not be forgiven, and actually the theme of permanence of sin would be at work, and you would see it counter-working with the theme of forgiveness throughout the novel. With this we move on to the next chapter, that is chapter 13, and here is the opening text of this chapter. The event of Tess d'Urberville's return from the manor of her bogus kinsfolk was rumoured abroad. If rumour be not too large a word for a space of a square mile. In the afternoon, several young girls of Marlott, former schoolfellows and acquaintances of Tess, called to see her, arriving dressed in their best starched and ironed, as became visitors to a person who had made a transcendent consequent, as they supposed, and sat round the room looking at her with great curiosity. For the fact that it was this said 31st cousin, Mr. d'Urberville, who had fallen in love with her, a gentleman not altogether local, whose reputation as a reckless gallant and heartbreaker was beginning to spread beyond the immediate boundaries of Trantridge, lent Tess's supposed position by its fearsomeness a far higher fascination that it would have exercised if unhazardous. Their interest was so deep that the younger ones whispered when her back was turned, "How pretty she is, and how that best frock do set her off. I believe it cost an immense deal and that it was a gift from him." So the girls already, you see, are talking about the good luck of Tess, and they think that the man, that is actually a reference to Alec, that he loves her and it is a gift from her, the frock that she is wearing. They ironically do not know what has happened to Tess, and their belief, firm belief in her good luck actually ironically makes Tess's misfortune or her bad luck even more prominent in this context. Tess, who was reaching up to get the tea things from the corner cupboard, did not hear these commentaries. If she had heard them, she might soon have set her friends right on the matter. But her mother heard, and John's simple vanity, having been denied the hope of a dashing marriage, fed itself as well as it could upon the sensation of a dashing flirtation. Upon the whole, she felt gratified. Even though such a limited and evanescent triumph should involve her daughter's reputation, it might end in marriage yet, and in the warmth of her responsiveness to their admiration, she invited her visitors to stay to tea. The text continues. Their chatter, their laughter, their good-humored innuendos, above all their flashes and flickerings of envy, revived Tess's spirits also. And as the evening wore on, she caught the infection of their excitement and grew almost gay. After all, Tess is a young girl, an immature girl, so somehow आप देखेंगे कि वो उनकी बातों से बहल गई है, and she is to some extent she is excited because of the excitement of the girls. The marble hardness left her face. She moved with something of her old bounding step and flushed in all her young beauty. At moments, in spite of thought, she would reply to their inquiries with a manner of superiority, as if recognizing that her experiences in the field of courtship had, indeed, been slightly enviable. But so far was she from being, in the words of Robert South, in love with her own ruin, that the illusion was transient as lightning. Cold reason came back to mock her spasmodic weakness. The ghastliness of her momentary pride would convict her and recall her to reserved listlessness again. At the despondency of the next morning's dawn, when it was no longer Sunday but Monday, and no best clothes and the laughing visitors were gone, and she awoke alone in her old bed, the innocent younger children breathing softly around her, that are the siblings, in place of the excitement of her return and the interest it had inspired, she saw before her a long and stony highway which she had to tread, without aid and with little sympathy. Her depression was then terrible, and she could have hidden herself in a tomb. So that momentary excitement is over, and she realizes that the journey ahead, the journey of life, is going to be a dull, monotonous and a stony, cold journey where she would not find any sympathy, where she would not find any support. And all this leads towards a terrible kind of depression. Anyhow, what we see overall in chapter 13, that some of Tess's friends, they visit her, and in their high-spirited company, Tess also feels cheered. However, next morning, as some time lapses, she goes back into her depression, and she wonders what would be her future, because it sounds very, very grim to her. To her, the future seems hopeless and bleak, and she realizes that she has become the subject of gossip around the countryside. In the course of several weeks, Tess revived sufficiently to get to church. When she goes to church, she hears the crowd whispering about her. This makes her feel dejected. She feels that she cannot come to church anymore. Thus, she falls into the habit of only going out after dark. So, a life of seclusion, a life where she separates herself from others and isolates herself because of her guilt, because of her misery, because of her experience. This is what we notice about Tess. When it comes to the critical discussion points related to this chapter, a couple of things are very, very important. Number one, the ironic situation. The ironic situation, why did Tess leave her home, and what happened to her expectations? In phase one, we noticed that she left her home to bring some kind of financial stability to the family, to provide some support to the family, and to compensate for the death of Prince that she thought she was to be blamed for. Ironically, what happened to these expectations to be of some use and to be of some help to the family, ironically, all this proved to be wrong. It proved to be false expectations, and the result was that she came back even in a far more miserable condition. It is a stunning reversal of fortune for Tess that she left to claim kinship with a noble family, but when she returns to Mal, it is a lower class standing that she has now before that, because she is unmarried yet pregnant with Alec d'Urberville's child. Theme of guilt, as I have said earlier, it recurs through the whole chapter again. It is her personal guilt that leads her to shrink from society. She feels that she is a sinner, she cannot face people, and she starts avoiding going out in the light. It would only be at the night time that she would go out. This guilt overweighs any social opposition that she may face in the upcoming chapters. This brings us to chapter 14 of phase 2. Again, there is some time lapse. The following August, Tess decides the time has come to stop pitying herself, and she helps her village with the harvest. We notice her distinct presence in the fields as she works there. And I think before discussing what else happens in this chapter, let us read some text about Tess working in the fields. Well, here is quite lengthy an extract from the text that is actually a part of the text about Tess as she works in the fields. The women, or rather girls, for they were mostly young, wore drawn cotton bonnets with great flapping curtains to keep off the sun, and gloves to prevent their hands being wounded by the stubble. There was one wearing a pale pink jacket, another in a cream-colored tight-sleeved gown, another in a petticoat as red as the arms of the reaping machine, and others older in the brown rough roper or overall, the old established and most appropriate dress of the field woman, which the young ones were abandoning. This morning the eye returns involuntarily to the girl in the pink cotton jacket, she being the most flexuous and finely drawn figure of them all. So you see, amongst all, when almost all of them look the same, still Tess is quite noticeable because of her beautiful figure, but her bonnet is pulled so far over her brow that none of her face is disclosed while she binds, though her complexion may be guessed from a stray twine or two of dark brown hair which extends below the curtain of her bonnet. Perhaps one reason why she seduces casual attention is that she never courts it, though the other women often gaze around them. So she is lost in her own thoughts. She is not interested in catching attention of anybody, and maybe this is the reason what Hardy says, that her lack of interest in grabbing anybody's attention actually generates the interest. Her binding proceeds with clock-like monotony. From the sheaf last finished, she draws a handful of ears, patting their tips with her left palm to bring them even. Then, stooping low, she moves forward, gathering the corn with both hands against her knees and pushing her left gloved hand under the bundle to meet the right on the other side, holding the corn in an embrace like that of a lover. She brings the ends of the bond together and kneels on the sheaf while she ties it, beating back her skirts now and then when lifted by the breeze. A bit of her naked arm is visible between the buff leather of the gauntlet and the sleeve of her gown, and as the day wears on, its feminine smoothness becomes sacrificed by the stubble and bleeds. At intervals, she stands up to rest and to re-tie her disarranged apron or to pull her bonnet straight. Then one can see the oval face of a handsome young woman with deep dark eyes and long, heavy clinging tresses which seem to clasp in a beseeching way anything they fall against. The cheeks are paler, the teeth more regular, the red lips thinner than is usual in a country-bred girl. So Hardy paints the complete portrait of Tess here for us. It is Tess Derbyfield, otherwise D'Urberville, somewhat changed, the same, but not the same. At the present stage of her existence, living as a stranger and an alien here, though it was no strange land that she was in. After a long seclusion, she had come to resolve to undertake outdoor work in her native village, the busiest season of the year in the agriculture world having arrived, and nothing that she could do within the house being so remunerative for the time as harvesting in the fields. So finally she has decided to come out in the world and to work as the other women around her work in the fields at this time of the year. Well, after reading this much part of the text, I would just say, let's see what happens, what else actually happens in this chapter. She has given birth actually to the child. We have actually been shown some lapse of time. We were already told that she was bearing the child of Alec. She gave birth to that child. Now she decides to christen him herself and she names him Sorrow. Now this name becomes symbolic. In a minute I would discuss its symbolic significance with you. When he dies the following morning, Tess asks the parson if her Christianity, if her christening was sufficient to earn her baby a Christian burial. Moved, the parson replies that though he cannot bury the child himself, Tess may do so. That night, Tess lays Sorrow to rest in a corner of the churchyard and makes a little cross for his grave. As she works in the field, her baby boy, conceived with Alec, is left back. Actually, what we notice about her is that before the death of her child, when the child was ill and while she was working in the fields, she would leave the child home, and as she would finish her labor during lunch, her sister would bring the child to her so that she may feed it. We also notice that a woman observes that Tess is fond of her child, although she might pretend to hate the child. But when the child falls ill, Tess becomes very much worried about the child, and he will die without, and she is worried that the child would die without a proper christening. So she actually begs her father to send for the parson, who refuses out of pride. Then Tess goes to bed, but the infant's breathing grows more difficult, and this is the time when Tess prays God for pity. Finally, this is actually the moment when she decides to christen him herself, and she decides to baptize him herself. She names him Sorrow, and as I already said that in a minute I would explain this symbolic significance of sorrow. I would say that the sorrowful event that took place, that changed the whole life of Tess, this child is a product of that event, of that happening. This sorrow is a reminder of that happening as well. So she rightly, I would say, has named her Sorrow. Anyhow, when Tess wakes up the next morning, she finds that Sorrow has died. Tess wants to bury the child as a Christian, but she wonders whether it was doctrinally sufficient to secure a child a Christian burial when she herself had baptized the child. Now she asks the parson, who agrees that Sorrow had been properly baptized. However, out of the community pressure and because of being afraid of the reaction of the community, he refuses to bury the child himself. She asks him not to speak to her as a saint to sinner, but as person to person. And actually this comment here by Tess is not a comment only by Tess. Here she becomes a mouthpiece of Hardy as well, who believes that the Christian religious guides and leaders, the clergymen, should not talk to people as saints talking to sinners. Rather, they should talk on more human grounds, that is person to person. Anyhow, finally the parson agrees that the burial of the child of Tess will be of the same nature and it will be the same, and we notice that Tess does it herself. Well, in order to understand how she feels and how she responds to the child, I think it would be a good idea to read some part of the text that is related to the whole event where Tess baptizes Sorrow, that is her child. Let's read the text. The household went to bed, and distressed beyond measure, Tess retired also. She was continually waking as she lay, and in the middle of the night found that the baby was still worse. It was obviously dying, quietly and painlessly, but nonetheless surely. In her misery, she rocked herself upon the bed. The clock struck the solemn hour of 1, that hour when fancy stalks outside reason, and malignant possibilities stand rock firm as facts. She thought of the child consigned to the nethermost corner of hell as its double doom for lack of baptism and lack of legitimacy, saw the archfiend tossing it with his three-pronged fork like the one they used for heating the oven on baking days, to which picture she added some many other quaint and curious details of torment sometimes taught the young in this Christian country. Now what we can notice is that Tess, no matter how very much she pretended to hate the child for the simple reason that it was a product of her sin, or it was a product of her weakness, or it was a product of something unpleasant that happened to her, after all, she is a mother. And being a mother, her concern for the child, especially when the child is very ill and is about to die, the child dying quietly and painlessly, this is what she sees. In this context, her concern for the child is very, very natural. And she is very, very much restless to see the child suffering, and she wants to baptize the child because she thinks that the child otherwise would be thrown into hell for 2 reasons. Number 1, lack of baptism, and number 2, lack of legitimacy. So she is just thinking of what she can do to save the child from the fire of hell. The lurid presentiment so powerfully affected her imagination in the silence of the sleeping house that her nightgown became damp with perspiration, and the bedstead shook with each throb of her heart. So she is very, very much distressed. The infant's breathing grew more difficult, and the mother's mental tension increased. It was useless to devour the little thing with kisses. She could stay in bed no longer, and walked feverishly about the room. "Oh, merciful God, have pity upon my poor baby," she cried. "Heap as much anger as you want to upon me, and welcome, but pity the child." So this is a mother's cry, we can see. She leant against the chest of drawers and murmured incoherent supplications for a long while, till she suddenly started up. Perhaps baby can be saved. Perhaps it will be just the same. So an idea occurs to her. She spoke so brightly that it seemed as though her face might have shone in the gloom surrounding her. Suddenly she finds a ray of hope. She has thought of something that might save her child from the wrath of God. She lit a candle and went to a second and a third bed under the wall, where she awoke her young sisters and brothers, all of whom occupied the same room. Pulling out the washing stand so that she could get behind it, she poured some water from a jug and made them kneel around, putting their hands together with fingers exactly vertical. While the children, scarcely awake, awe-stricken at her manner, their eyes growing larger and larger, remained in this position, she took the baby from her bed, a child's child. Notice the use of language by Hardy, a child's child, so immature as scarce to seem, a sufficient personality to endow its producer with the maternal title. Tess herself was a very young girl, just a child, and now that she has born a child, the maternal affection, the manner how a mother would deal with a child, it is very, very visible that she is quite immature to do all that. Tess then stood erect with the infant on her arm beside the basin. The next sister held the prayer book open before her, as the clerk at church held it before the parson, and thus the girl set out baptizing her child. Look at the misery of Tess. She herself now, as she is not allowed to get her child baptized by the clergyman, she is baptizing the child as a mother with the hope, just for the hope that the child would be saved from the wrath of God and from the fire of hell. The text continues, her figure looked singularly tall and imposing as she stood in her long white nightgown, a thick cable of twisted dark hair hanging straight down her back to her waist. The kindly dimness of the weak candle abstracted from her form and features the little blemishes which sunlight might have revealed, the stubble scratches upon her wrists and the weariness of her eyes, her high enthusiasm having a transfiguring effect upon the face which had been her undoing, showing it as a thing of immaculate beauty with a touch of dignity which was almost regal. The little ones kneeling around, their sleepy eyes blinking in dread, awaited her preparations, full of a suspensed wonder which their physical heaviness at that hour would not allow to become active. The most impressed of them said, "Be you really going to christen him, Tess?" The girl mother replied in a grave affirmative. "What's his name going to be?" She had not thought of that, but a name suggested by a phrase in the book of Genesis came into her head as she proceeded with the baptismal service, and now she pronounced it. Sorrow. I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. She sprinkled the water, and there was silence. Say amen, children. The tiny voices piped in obedient response. Amen. So, she is doing all the rituals of baptizing, and she has named the child very rightly as Sorrow. When it comes to critical discussion of this chapter, I have already raised some points. Here are a few points that I would like to bring to your attention. In terms of plot, we notice that Hardy once again shifts the narrative forward, skipping a lot of time and events happening during that time in Tess's life. It is only as we read this chapter that we realize that Tess has given birth to a baby boy, and the boy is not very well and is going to die soon. And it is through this chapter we see that Tess baptizes the child before the child dies. We find anyhow that almost a year in Tess's life has passed. In this chapter the story starts after Tess has given birth to the illegitimate child. This child is the living representation of her sin. Even the name, as I have said earlier, that Tess has given to the child, Sorrow, represents the aftermath of her sin. Hardy is famous for using his symbols in a very, very intelligent way. The symbol of sorrow is very important. We need to notice the following things with reference to this symbol. Sorrow is a symbol of Tess's guilt over her weakness with Alec d'Urberville. But we need to notice Tess's reaction to her child. She hates the child as it is a symbol, a sign of her weakness. From detest, she gradually starts getting used to the child. So from detest to growing used to acceptance to love. We see in this chapter her relationship getting stronger with the child till the last point where she baptizes the child. And as she baptizes the child, we can see the true love of a mother for a child, irrespective of whether a legitimate child or not. As far as the baptism of sorrow is concerned, I would say it is equal to the rejection of the social structure. In a typical social and religious structure, actually the ceremony of baptism is to be performed by a clergyman. Here she does it herself. In yet another way, I would say baptism of sorrow is baptism of Tess again. A new Tess, as we would see, she emerges out of all this process of baptizing the child, we would see her in a completely different light as she would emerge out of all this, a completely different woman. I think this is a significant part of her journey from being a girl to a woman, and a lot of learning, though very, very painful learning, I would say, is taking place at this time point in the novel. Well, this brings us to chapter 15 of this phase. We see Tess getting more mature. She began to note the passing of anniversaries, such as her first arrival at Trantridge and the fateful night at the Chase. She also realizes that she can never be happy in Mallet, so now she wishes to begin a new life in a place where her past is unknown to people. We also notice how Tess has changed from a simple girl to a complex woman. Her eyes grow larger and more eloquent. She has learned a lot from life, though a very hard way. However, we notice that she is still concerned with the issue of chastity. Once lost, she wonders if it is lost forever, if it is always lost or not. Anyhow, as she wants a new beginning, she gets a chance the next year. There is an opportunity to become a milkmaid at Talbot's dairy. She realizes the opportunity partially because it is near the ancestral estate of the D'Urbervilles, and partially because she has a desire to start a new life. Well, critically looking at this chapter, what is important is the development of the character of Tess. We notice her growing in maturity. We also see her changing from, this is a typo, this is not from, it is from, a timid girl to a strong and courageous woman. One of the landmarks of her maturity and rebirth is the event of baptizing sorrow, as it took place in the previous chapter. It is after this that Tess decides to leave Mallet, that is her place of birth, for a place where she may start her new life. Theme of forgiveness again runs through the chapter. At this point, Hardy again brings into question the issues of forgiveness. The question of the extent to which sins may be forgiven again is raised by Hardy. In this instance, the question is given explicitly: can Tess regain her purity and chastity after all this? This becomes a crucial question in the context of what has happened. Well, what we have seen that with this, the second phase of Tess's life is complete, and the second phase of the novel, that is subtitled as Maiden No More, is also completed. Actually, phase 2, that as I have said, is subtitled as Maiden No More. It presents the consequences of Tess's fall in phase 1. We see development in the character of Tess. We see her growing and getting mature. She is far more mature now. This is a journey of a young, innocent girl becoming a mature woman with far more knowledge of the world and the ways of the world. We see her acceptance of the child. We also see her rejection of the social norms, where she herself takes the responsibility of baptizing her child and burying the child in the Christian way. We notice her concern for her parents and siblings. Despite all that has happened, she still feels that she is responsible for her family. She still feels the need to fulfill her familial obligations and to provide some support to the family. She still wants to start her life afresh, at some other place where she can start her life again, and where she can again seek some opportunities to provide some financial support to the family. It becomes ironic in the sense that the first journey that she took to Alex's farmhouse, it was with the desire to bring some good and to bring some financial support to the family, but it ended up with degrading her more, with her, you see, social status being further lowered. Now that she is once again planning to be of some use to the family, now that being overcome with the first phase of her life, of all the shame and degradation that she had to face. She again is at a stage after the loss of her child, sorrow. Now she thinks that leaving this place would be better for her, going to yet another place, exploring yet other opportunities, and working in yet newer contexts might be of some help to her. This is what she thinks. Overall, commenting on phase 2, I would say that phase the second is primarily a transitional period, whereas in phase 1 we see her blaming her mother. Why didn't you tell me there was danger in Menfolk? Why didn't you warn me? And as sees herself as a victim of her own ignorance, in phase 2 she shows herself growing more in maturity. Another important theme of the novel emerges in this phase, and we noticed in the previous session that Tess is fated to tragedy. It is befitted for her to face tragedy. In this phase, we learn about the human instinct that leads Tess to oppose her fate. The invincible instinct towards self-delight. Well, I would like to talk about Hardy's philosophy that he has presented through this phrase, the invincible instinct towards self-delight. What he believes in is that despite all the odds, despite all the hardships, despite all the suffering, it is an instinctive part of human nature to strive for good, to strive for, to work for, to make effort for self-delight, for happiness. And same happens in the case of Tess. Tess's healthy desire simply to be happy is perhaps the source of her great courage and moral strength that would lead her towards, seeking a better future, towards working hard to have a better position in the society and to be of some use to her family. With this, we come to the end of phase 2 of the novel Tess of D'Urberville. We have seen what happened to her in first phase. The consequence to that is completed in phase 2, and the upcoming phase, that is phase 3, that we would cover inshallah in the next session, would provide us a chance to see a fresh start that Tess takes to live, yet making another effort to live not only for herself but also for her family, by finding her place somewhere in the world. Before I close, I would just quickly like to review today's session. We started phase 2, that was from chapter 12 to 15. So what we notice is that it was comparatively, in terms of structure, the phase was not very lengthy and it just had a few chapters. In doing so, we covered the following aspects. We looked at the text of these chapters and explored related themes to these chapters. I also discussed the development of certain characters, especially the character of Tess, from her development from a young, innocent girl to a far mature woman, from a girl to a mother. And we also critically looked at the selected parts of the text and saw how certain themes were embedded within the text. With this, I come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much.